Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're very safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of virtual conversations about issues of critical importance to America and to the world. And welcome to today's session, One State, Two, or None at All. Where do Israelis and Palestinians go from here? 20 years ago this week, Americans, Israelis, and Palestinians met at Camp David in the stunning beauty of the Catoctin Mountains to try to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 3 of the 4 of us on this panel were there, and we're in the process of trying to get Nabil Shath hooked in from Ramallah. And I can tell you with great confidence that there were at least double that number of different explanations as to why this summit failed. Some blame Arafat and claim he was never interested in reaching an agreement. Others believe Barak, having wasted too much time in exploring a deal with the Syrians, rushed to the summit expecting too much from the Palestinians and being unwilling to give enough. Others say that the U.S. should have known better. Only the second time in 40 years that an American president convened a summit. Why did we go? And President Clinton, despite his genuine commitment to this process, inspired us all at the second briefing by basically saying trying and failing is better than not having tried at all. Although on reflection, I'm now persuaded that that's a much better slogan for the University of Michigan football team than it is a substitute for U.S. foreign policy. My own view of these matters is more deterministic. The conditions to reaching a conflict-ending agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, in my view, have never been present, weren't present at Camp David, nor in the 20 years that followed, and are surely not present now. What's required, we're here to discuss. Final point before I introduce our panelists. Faulkner was certainly right when he wrote in Requiem for the Nun that the past is never dead. It's never even past. But today we're going to try to move forward from more promising times, sadly, to what I suspect is a much less promising future. My hope in solving this problem remains, largely because we don't know the future. Anyone living in the United States or in the world over the last 4 months should be cautioned about making predictions, positive or negative, about what may come. And at any rate, abandoning hope is morally unconscionable. But my illusions are gone, and I'm looking for our 3 panelists to strengthen the former, strengthen my hope. All 3 are practitioners, but they are also thoughtful analysts and observers of Israeli, Palestinian, and American politics and diplomacy. I've known them all for many years. I consider them to be colleagues and friends. Professor Emeritus Shlomo Ben-Ami of Tel Aviv University is a historian, former Israeli diplomat, and politician. He served as Israel's Minister of Internal Security and Foreign Minister in 1999 to 2000. He currently serves as Vice President of the Toledo International Center for Peace, of which he is a co-founder. Nabil Shath, who hopefully will join us soon, was the Foreign Minister of Palestine from 2003 to 2005, former Minister of Planning and International Cooperation, and a former member of Fatah's Central Committee. He's currently finishing up a book on the peace process between 1994 and 2001. Finally, Tamara Kaufman-Wittes is a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings, where she focuses on U.S. policy in the Middle East. Tamara served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from November of 2009 to January 2012, coordinating U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East during the Arab uprisings. Each will speak for 5 minutes. A moderated round with me will follow, then to your Q&A. So with that in mind, and with great hopes of getting Nabil into this call, Shlomo, I'm going to turn the virtual space and floor over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. It occurs to me that with passage of time, one can perhaps look at the Camp David experience in a somewhat kindler way. Its end result was, after all, a set of proposals that would serve as the framework upon which President Clinton would build 6 months later the Clinton peace parameters. So the Palestinians were right, at least in one sense. They never believed that Camp David was the endgame. They always saw it as one summit in a series of meetings. And indeed, this is what happened. That the summit was preceded by a number of important meetings, and those followed by 6 months of negotiations, culminating in December 2000 with the Clinton peace parameters. So we should then speak not of the, in my view, of the Camp David summit, but of the Camp David process. And as such, it produced what I believe is the most equitable peace plan, even a brilliant point of equilibrium between the positions, or the most advanced positions, of Israelis and Palestinians as they stood at the time. And I would suggest to look at the Clinton parameters not from the perspective of whether they met the optimal requirements or the optimal dreams of the parties, but to look at them from the perspective of today. That is, of these days when we live in a state of total loss of hope for Palestinian redemption and a persistent Israeli occupation of the territories, with ties morally and politically for the occupier as well. So seen from that perspective, perhaps the Clinton peace parameters, that is the Camp David process, was not such a bad thing. I bet that more than one Palestinian and more than one Israeli would miss these parameters and this kind of American involvement, with this kind of commitment by an American president, not unilateral, but trying to bring parties together, having negotiations, looking for a compromise. This is what Camp David process is all about. We haven't had that since. So 30 years after Madrid, 25 years after Oslo, 20 years after Camp David, the two-state solution has never been so far away than it is today. It is a remote possibility. I believe it doesn't exist really. Only one more time a serious attempt was made by George W. Bush, the Annapolis concept, Annapolis process, the proposal of Ehud Olmert, which even went beyond the Clinton parameters on the territorial aspect. He proposed, in fact, 100% of the land. We proposed 97%. Proposed the internationalization of Jerusalem. We proposed partition, that is the internationalization of the Old City in Jerusalem. We proposed partition. But in essence, the Clinton peace parameters are the litmus test upon which all future peace adventures were built. And since I think that we can be, as I said in my opening sentence, kindlier to the Camp David process. It's not such a monumental failure. It is portrayed by poignant memoirs written about it. Now, following Camp David, what happened later? Of course, these failures, our failure and Olmert's failure, I see them as defining failures. They are not technical failures. They are not the kind of situation where you can say you needed a kvetch here and kvetch there, you have a settlement. The message that these failures convey to us, I believe, is that the bridging the gap between what is possible and what is necessary for a peace deal has been impossible, and perhaps is impossible. In the meeting of these two monumental narrative egos, Palestinian and the Israeli. So another consequence of the failure was the destruction of the Israeli peace camp, so-called peace camp. In fact, it is as if the peace tribe or the emotional legacy of the peace tribe has been destroyed and occupied by another tribe that doesn't believe that peace is at all possible between us and the Palestinians, and they build their political power on the deceptions of this process, on the lessons they drew from the past. So Israel has moved radically to the right and even to the far right. In fact, the left here, this is the same left that Netanyahu mobilizes his base against, is a non-existent category, or at least it is a dwindling quantity. Another phenomenon that happened after years following Camp David is unilateralism became the kind of political religion. Sharon contacted unilateralism, and the reason that negotiations with Palestinians for a final settlement are no longer on the agenda. One of the reasons, Sharon articulated it very well. He said every prime minister that negotiated a final settlement ended with his political career destroyed. So I'm not going to destroy my political career because negotiating with Palestinians means getting into the palace that leads me to solution. And he was right, politically speaking, obviously. So on the Palestinian side, you can see also the split that happened. I remember saying that Camp David to our friend Saeb Erekat in the presence of your entire team, that if we go from here without a settlement, it will be the rise of Israel right and the rise of Hamas. And it happened. So, of course, what is persisting is Israel's land grabbing and expansion of settlements. All this is making the two-state solution still technically possible. I concur with people like Shaul Arieli and others that say it is still technically possible. Of course, it is technically possible. You can always go into a lab and write an ideal piece of that. But in real life, it has never worked. Not even Geneva was the Geneva understanding were applauded by the parties, by Israelis and Palestinians. And then is another phenomenon that we need to bring into the discussion, and this is the fact that the demotion of the Palestinian question from its supposed from being the supposed center of the worries of the Middle East region, the Palestinian question is no longer the center of the occupation of Israel's neighbors, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and all the others. In fact, they have developed sort of an alliance with Israel, but a discreet alliance. Israel has become the concubine of these of countries like Saudi Arabia, and they have relegated the Palestinian problem. I'm not saying that they will applaud Israel's moves in the West Bank, not at all, but they are not mobilized the way they were mobilized in the times where we negotiated.
Shlomo, thank you. We're going to return to these themes, but I see that miraculously Nabil Shath has appeared on our screen. Nabil, is that you?
Yes, hi, how are you?
We're great.
To all of you. I'm sorry, but it took me some time to adjust my telephone.
Right, it's fine, fine. And Shlomo, when we get to the moderator round, if you could try to speak more directly into the mic, because I think we're having a little trouble hearing you.
Okay.
And again, I appreciate your comment on the parameters, and I agree. But the fundamental question still remains, why no agreement? What are the factors on each side that have prevented a conflict-ending solution these many years? And we're going to return to that I think, in the Q&A. So without further ado, Nabil, let me turn things over to you.
Okay. Why haven't we reached an agreement? Well,
Why haven't we reached an agreement, Nabil, and where do we go from here? Those are the two fundamental questions we need to ask and perhaps answer. But go ahead.
Okay. Do you want to ask the question now, or should I make my comments first?
No, please offer your comments.
Okay. I mean, the problem is there are only two possible solutions here. Either a one-state solution, a one-state that is democratic, secular, multinational, has Jews, Christians, and Muslims in one democratic state. And that is a solution that I personally was highly involved in doing. And in fact, in 1968, 69, I was able to get full approval from the Palestinian National Council to make this our objective. But that didn't work. The Israelis don't want that. They want a Zionist state. They don't want a democratic state for all the population. So then we went to the two-state solution on the basis of the borders of 1967. And that too did not work out. They still occupy all of the West Bank. They withdrew from Gaza, which allowed Hamas to go on its separate plan in Gaza. And in the West Bank, not only is there are building of new colonial settlements in every part of the West Bank, but now the Israeli government want to annex those settlements and annex parts of Area C in the Palestinian area, and annex parts on the River Jordan Valley, which all just destroys the possibility of a two-state solution. So without a two-state solution and a one-state solution, there is no solution. We still have an Israeli occupation, and we are still struggling hard to get back our rights to part of Palestine, which is only 24% of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza.
Do you want to offer a comment or two, Nabil, on, I mean, when you say no solution, do you mean nothing can be done?
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that nothing can be done. And I think a major part in making things get straight is the United States itself. And I think a great part of my blame on why Camp David failed and why other attempts failed is because the United States administrations never really took seriously their responsibility in order to get a solution going. And now with Mr. Trump, the president of the United States, and with the Trump plan and all of that, which encouraged Mr. Netanyahu to talk about annexation, things are worse. And so with a unipolar world like the world that we still live in, where the United States has so much power, and with the United States being the major existential ally of Israel, and with a policy like that of Mr. Trump, it's very difficult to see a solution that can produce results. We are ready for a solution. We are ready for a multi-party international guidance instead of the unique United States role in running these negotiations. We are willing to accept international law as the basis for our negotiations. We are willing to accept a two-state solution to be the basis for the negotiations. But that is not moving, particularly because of the United States.
Fair enough. We'll return to the whole question of U.S. mediation in the Q&A, but it provides, and I'm glad you're with us today, Nabil. I was a little concerned. It provides a very good transition, I think, to Tamara. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Tamara. If you could, among your comments, address the whole issue of the American role, it would be greatly appreciated. So please, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Aaron. And let me start by saying what an honor it is to be with three men who have devoted so many years of their lives to the effort to bring about a peaceful resolution of this conflict. I want to pivot off of what Shlomo said about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict no longer being at the center of regional geopolitics or the concerns of the states in the region. And while it's true that a lot has happened in this region that pushes this conflict lower down the priority list for a lot of governments, I would argue that there is still a big downside risk for all of these governments if the conflict degrades, if it flares up, if it returns to a phase of active violence. And that is really where I fear we may be heading. When I think about the impact of the Oslo process in general and the structure it created, the negotiations it created, the Camp David summit, the Clinton parameters, what was the revolution that Oslo meant for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? It transformed a conflict that had been seen by both sides as existential, in which there was no fundamental recognition of the legitimacy of the other side, into a conflict that was political, where Israel and the PLO recognized one another as inescapable partners in negotiating an outcome. That was the radical transformation that the Oslo Accords enabled. And I agree with the view that even though the Camp David summit itself did not achieve a resolution, that was not the death blow itself to that transformation of the conflict into a political conflict. I think that what we've seen since the collapse of Camp David, though, really have been wounds to the possibility of a political solution. We saw the Second Intifada, the astonishing levels of violence and the trauma that the Second Intifada imposed both on Israeli society and on Palestinian society in a way that really undermined hopes for peaceful coexistence. We saw the gradualism of the Oslo process, that it was supposed to be this temporary transitional period that was meant to help build confidence in coexistence, actually ended up undermining confidence in coexistence, especially on the Palestinian side, because they came to view gradualism as an excuse for not moving forward. And instead of 5 years transitional period, we're now, 25 years in plus. And then we saw the division within the Palestinian polity between the West Bank and Gaza, between Hamas and the PLO. And so we're at a point today, even before the Trump proposals, we're at a point today where where Israelis and Palestinians are every day asking themselves the question, is the other side, for Israelis, is the PLO still our inescapable, inevitable, necessary partner for peace? And Palestinians are asking themselves, after 10 years of Netanyahu, is this Israeli government, if this is the Israeli government we're stuck with, is this a partner for resolving this conflict politically? And then on top of that, you put the Trump proposals, which I agree with Nabil and Shlomo. They eviscerate some of the fundamentals that had been achieved in Israel-PLO negotiation and in American mediation. And they set all of us back. They put the United States in a position where it's very difficult for us to be a credible force bringing Israelis and Palestinians together without doing a lot of our own reparative work, because they struck at some of those fundamentals of the peace process. And so I worry that the effect of the Trump proposals, even though they have not gotten any traction, even though they will not produce any kind of peace, I worry that they have destroyed what's left of this degraded, eroded Oslo framework. And I worry that they will set this conflict on a path away from a political conflict and back into something much more existential.
Yeah, I mean, nobody ever lost money betting against success in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, although you would have won heavily had you bet on an Israeli-Egyptian process, had you bet on an Israeli-Jordanian process. And frankly, when people say at Camp David we were this close to an agreement, that obviously is not correct. We were this close to agreement on the core issues, even on the Israeli-Syrian track. In the end, it was a matter of real estate, not identity. So let me ask each of you, we're not going to fix the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today, but I want to get at some of the more difficult fundamental questions. And I want to look not backward or forward first. I want to look inward. So I want to ask each of you. I realize, Shlomo, you do not represent the entire Israeli body politic. Nabil, the same on the Palestinian side. Tamar on the American side. But if you had to identify, and this requires a certain amount of self-criticism and honesty. I mean, I've been looking back for the last 17 years with 1,000 mea culpas of the mistakes that Americans have made in negotiations. It's not a comfortable position to be in. But if I had to ask each of you, beginning with you, Shlomo, what is the single greatest mistake that Israel has made when it comes to negotiating with the Palestinians? What would it be? And I'm not talking here tactics. I'm talking about a fundamental transgression, which had it not been made, might have altered the course in a more positive way. Is there such a thing? Nobody's blameless for this, clearly. It's not one hand clapping, and nor is it a morality play that pits the forces of goodness on one hand against the forces of darkness and evil on the other. It's a terribly complicated conflict, both sides having legitimate needs and requirements and needs to be satisfied. What's the single greatest mistake successive Israeli governments have made in their negotiations with the Palestinians?
Well, I think that I will mention perhaps a couple of them. I'll be even more generous. One is that no Israeli government has taken the strategic decision that 1967 should be the final border of Israel. This is a decision that the Palestinians did make. That is their proclaimed position. That hasn't been the proclaimed position of Israeli government, although, as I said before, the final deal was more or less around, or the final proposals were more or less around the 1967 borders. And the second mistake was to continue with the march of folly of settlement expansion simultaneously with negotiations. Right. I think that even in the Rabin days, there was an increase in the population, not necessarily in the expansion of settlements, but yes, in the population of settlers in the West Bank. These were two big mistakes. But I can, of course, mention one or two mistakes by the Palestinians, but I will leave this to Nabil, since we are talking about self-criticism.
Thank you. Nabil has disappeared. Hopefully he will return shortly. So Tamara, let me go to you.
Here he is.
Oh, there you are.
Well, I was told that your mic is muted. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Can everyone hear Nabil?
Yes.
Okay.
Wonderful. So Nabil, what is the single greatest mistake, I would say transgression, far more serious than a mistake, not of a tactical nature, that Palestinians have made in their own negotiations with the Israelis?
Well, in Camp David, I know because I was an active participant in Camp David. I think Jerusalem was the basic issue. And then comes the issue of the refugees. The issue of land and security and all of that could have been solved. We came to a situation which is very, very difficult really to have passed, and that is giving up the important places of East Jerusalem that are the center of all the commitments and the center of all the problems. I think Jerusalem basically was the basic problem. And then there was the question of the refugees. Other things could have been solved. I don't think we made mistakes in not trying to get things done. But on Jerusalem, we reached a situation in which it was very difficult, I think, for the parties to go back to their consistencies and tell them we are giving up this or we're giving you that. And then that was followed with the assassination of Rabin and with the storming by Mr. Sharon of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which really led to the Intifada. I mean, the Intifada did not come out of a plan that was made by Yasser Arafat and Abu Mazen before we went to Camp David, as the common Israeli story. That was not the case. We were really hopeful that we'll come back from the Camp David with a solution. And since we were not able to do that, then the situation went from one problem to another. And I think the assassination of Rabin was a major problem, and the takeover by Mr. Sharon and his storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the holy areas really made it very, very difficult to make any concessions at the time.
Right. I'll push you, though, Nabil. Those are challenges and circumstances that arose to make things more complicated. I mean, in the world, nobody's perfect. And in a conflict this complex, everybody bears a measure of responsibility for its perpetuation. I mean, I'm not an Israeli and I'm not a Palestinian, so the costs of my mistakes, in many respects, are not as existential. You know, I live in Chevy Chase, Maryland, as they are for the costs of mistakes that Israelis and Palestinians may make. But it's difficult, having worked on this process for more than, almost 25 years, to accept the proposition that nobody erred in either not grabbing an opportunity that was available or pushing for too much in this category and not enough in the other. It's a hard question. I'm not suggesting it's not, but everyone bears a measure of responsibility for this. And I'm just trying to elicit what you think the Palestinian responsibility is. I mean, maybe you believe that Palestinians bear no responsibility. They're clearly the weakest parties to the conflict. I understand that. They're under occupation. There's no precedent in modern history for a people negotiating its way out of an occupation, I don't think, and building the institutions of self-government at the same time. It's a unique situation. It's difficult. And I'm not here to judge you, but I just wondered what you might identify as a serious Palestinian shortcoming.
Well, I think our inability to maintain our unity was a major problem, and we went. I mean, I was one of those who worked very hard for going to elections, democratic elections, and into passing by a national consensus a constitution that is highly democratic. But the result of the elections was that Hamas took over in Gaza. Yes. In fact, it would have taken over all around because they won the elections. But that really probably there is some similarity here. When Mr. Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish Israeli extremist, and then came Mr. Sharon. I mean, again here, the changes that took place in Israel and the changes that took place in us led, in our case, because of the separation between Gaza and the West Bank, into separating Gaza and the West Bank, not only geographically, but also politically.
Yes.
And that separation made it very difficult to reach a consensus negotiations with the Israelis. So on our side, I think our inability to maintain our unity was a major weakness that followed the results of the failure of Camp David and the negotiating arena with the Israelis and the Americans.
Thanks, Nabil. It's a fair point. So Tamara, let me go to you to speak on behalf of 330 million of your fellow citizens. What is the single greatest mistake the Americans have made in approaching their role in negotiating, brokering, mediating, facilitating, whatever word you want to use, these negotiations?
Well, Aaron, it is most unfair for you to be asking me that question, because this is a question that that you are much better positioned to answer, and that you have answered beautifully in writing, including in your book. And so I can add my own analysis, but I think what I'd like to do is focus on the post-Camp David period, but also on where we go from here, because, you know, given the threshold that we are on in the conflict and in American foreign policy, what we really need to do is think about how we correct, what we do differently. But what I'll say, you know, historically, I think there was an opportunity when Sharon announced his intent to withdraw from Gaza to use that as a springboard for renewed Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He needed politically to do it as a unilateral step, but there were ways to make it more closely coordinated with the newly elected, newly legitimate PA president and chairman of the PLO, Mahmoud Abbas, that would have strengthened the forces of coexistence and compromise in Israeli and Palestinian societies, and that might have prevented the outcome that we saw in Gaza in 2007. So historically, I would point to that particular turning point as significant. And I think the Bush administration just said, well, you need to do it yourself. Okay, go ahead.
Right.
But I think in terms of where we are from here, to me, the biggest thing to change is the way the United States structures its own efforts with respect to the peace process, or with respect to Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution. We have to recognize that we have backslid in this conflict way back. We're back in a phase where the United States and other concerned international and regional parties need to stop trying to force these guys to a table that they're not ready to sit at and where they're not going to get things done. And we need to go back to pre-negotiation phase, where we have broad conversations about goals and interests and red lines. And then we start to see how we can fit the pieces of the puzzle together. The most important thing for the United States to do is to recognize that in this moment, in this world, in this region, and with the United States positioned as it is, we cannot monopolize this process and expect it to succeed. I don't think this is any longer a conflict that the United States can solve or mediate by itself. Even Oslo didn't happen, you know, because the United States made it happen. It happened with the help of others. And so I think that means working more with other regional governments. I think it means working more with other members of the international community. And I also think it means, and here's a lesson of the first Camp David summit, you know, the preparations for the Israel-Egypt negotiations on the American side involved, you know, this wonderful tight circle of consultation between our ambassador in Cairo, our ambassador in Tel Aviv, you know, and our State Department officials in Washington. It was not a separate office walled off from the rest of the State Department or sitting in the White House. And that was what enabled us to bring in other international players who had a role to play, to understand the broader context within which the negotiation was sitting. And I think that's where we need to be today. So Aaron, even though I met you when you were in the special Middle East coordinator's office, I would not today reconstitute that office.
Right. Well, as you know, over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, the so-called peace process, when it functioned and when it didn't, always remained the purview of a small number of individuals. At times it functioned well, and at times it did not function well. There's no question about it. One thing I will say, though, without hesitation, is that we really did need and did not have many more women involved in this negotiation, not just on the American side, frankly, but on all sides. And I think I really do deeply believe whether we could have solved it or not is another matter.
You had the women in the Annapolis process on our side. It didn't produce a deal.
Right.
May I offer a couple of comments?
Of course. I want to get to the whole notion of the U.S. role, but go ahead. Yes, Shlomo.
Very quickly. One, I don't think really, I mean, this is not self-criticism. This is criticism. I don't think that the mistakes of the Palestinians were of a tactical nature. I think they were of a strategic nature. That is, seizing the historical moment, seizing the ripeness of the conditions for a deal that might not last forever. Because history is about change, and conditions change, and the Middle East changed, and the politicians are no longer there. And politics is not a sideshow. Politics is the central pillar of any peacemaking attempt. So I think that this was the mistake. Now, we are talking about either no two-state solution or one-state solution. I think that the one-state solution is an ivory tower nonsense.
Yeah,
I remember Tony Judd writing about it. Now I see Peter Beinart writing about it, and so on. This will be a South African situation without a South African solution, because the Israeli minority, as it were, will never compromise the core message of the Zionist idea, and that is, and I sense that this might be the case with the Palestinians as well. Here in the Middle East, a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy, what was impossible for the Czech and the Slovaks, the Turks and Greek in Cyprus, in the Middle East, where Sunnis are fighting Shiites, in the Muslim minority, where minorities are gassed and slaughtered, in the former Yugoslavia universe, where the differences of the narcissism of minor differences led to genocide and slaughters, etc. You want it here in the Middle East, it won't work. It will be a rape, not a marriage. So I think that we need to forget about it. What might happen, short, obviously, two-state solution, which is the ideal, but I don't see that happening. What you might see is not unilateral annexation. You might see perhaps unilateral disengagement, which was the plan that Sharon had in the West Bank as well. In fact, he started it in the West Bank, in the north western corner of the West Bank. Olmert was elected on that ticket, on the convergence plan. The DNA of Zionism hasn't been yet so totally perverted by the settlers, and that is demography is more important than rhetoric. And I believe that whenever Zionism in the past and in the future will face this dilemma, it will choose demography over rhetoric. And you might see a unilateral disengagement, which might draw Jordan into the business of the West Bank, the way that the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza drew the Egyptians back into Gaza. I think that, but as a whole, we don't have a clear scenario for the future. When Harold Macmillan was asked many years ago, the British Prime Minister, what is the future, the prime minister, what is going to happen in the future? His answer was, events, my boy, events. So we will have to wait for Clio. Clio was for us in 2000. I think that Nabil is wrong when he insists on Rabin. Rabin would have never gone to the length that he went. Never in a lifetime. So I think that you are canonizing Rabin because he was assassinated. It happened normally. It happened to Clinton. It happened, Kennedy. It happened to Lincoln. Normally we canonize this kind of situations. But I think that Rabin would have never gone. And I had with you, Nabil, that same discussion. I think it was in Marseille, when we, in the meeting of the ministers of foreign affairs of the Mediterranean. You spoke longing about Rabin the day that Leah Rabin, his widow, wrote in a newspaper in Israel that had Rabin heard about our concessions, he would have turned back in his own grave. That was his wife saying that. But I think that, leave Rabin aside, he would not have gone to the particular partition of Jerusalem, Act 1967, refugees. This is a pipe dream. So we went to the land that we could have gone as Jews and as Israelis, and at the right time, right moment. And it didn't work out. I'm not saying that you are to blame. I say in a joint enterprise, everybody's to blame. The Americans, when just a word about what Tamara said, they never saw the Palestinian-Israeli negotiation as a national security issue for the United States. It had much more of a sentimental dimension in it. It was not a national security issue where failure is not an option. Failure is an option and nothing bad happens to America. So I think that this is where the Americans perhaps did what they could. But since it was not something where failure is not an option, they didn't use the leverages they needed to use on Israel. I'm not saying on the Palestinians. They should have done on the Palestinians as well. Israel is a sentimental issue in America, and I'm not going to give you a lecture about it. What is the resonance of Israel in America? It's a political issue in the United States, and it has been an impediment to using the necessary leverage.
Thanks, Shlomo.
Nabil, and the international community. One last word.
Shlomo, I want to give Nabil an opportunity to respond. Nabil, is there something you'd like to add to any of what Shlomo said?
Well, I'm sorry, but there is some technical problems about listening. I don't think
it's
got it all right.
It's hard to hear. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to just offer not a defense of American policy, but an explanation. It is no coincidence that the three major breakthroughs in the Arab-Israeli conflict, Israel-Egypt, Israel-Palestine, and Israel-Jordan, occurred without the foreknowledge of the United States. And that is not a coincidence. When Dayan showed up at the State Department in 1977, briefing our predecessors about the fact that he was carrying on secret negotiations with Sadat's vice president, people were stunned. We were on vacation in Florida in August of '93 when State Ops called to say, you better come back because Secretary Christopher's headed to California to see Prime Minister or Foreign Minister Peres and Foreign Minister Holst. We knew about the Oslo channel. We didn't know it was a decision-making channel. And the Israelis and Jordanians have been negotiating for decades, clandestinely and secretly, without the knowledge of the United States. My point, I suspect, and I resurrected a phrase out of Henry Kissinger's memoirs for Jim Baker in the 90s, and Kissinger wrote in his memoirs that he did not want to be seen or function as Israel's lawyer. That in fact, if you wanted to make progress, you needed one client and only one. And that client was an agreement. And you become the lawyer for both sides. Baker loved that. And frankly, not since Bush 41 and James Baker have we had an administration that was prepared to push both sides and offer both sides enough honey and vinegar to create incentives and disincentives to reach an agreement. I would contend to all of you, and I have not given up hope in a two-state solution because I think a one-state solution is an illusion tethered to a fantasy wrapped in an impossibility. I just think that the conditions that are required to achieve that have never existed. That would be leaders who are masters of their political constituencies, not prisoners of them. That would be a fair effort to reach an agreement that satisfies Israeli and Palestinian needs on the core issues, and an administration, third party. Let's just take the US out of it. Any third party that was prepared to be willful and skillful in order to reach an agreement. That was missing at Camp David. It's been missing for the last 20 years, and it's missing now. We have a question from the audience about the next administration. We have a few minutes, 5 or 6. So I want to ask each of you whether or not, or no, not whether or not, what kind of difference will it make on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, whether or not Donald Trump gets a second term, or whether Joe Biden becomes president of the United States? Tamara, let me start with you. What difference will it make?
Yeah, I think it could make a tremendous difference in shifting the trajectory of this conflict. I think if Trump is reelected, if the Israeli government has not gone ahead with the annexation by November, it will do so, knowing that it has President Trump offering what no American administration has ever offered or any future administration would ever offer, which is American recognition of the permanent Israeli control of territory conquered in 1967. That is such a boon to such a large proportion of the Israeli public and political leadership at this point, that I think the pressure would be irresistible to annex. And if the annexation moves forward, then I think there are a whole set of consequences that follow from that. It is such an egregious violation of the Oslo Accords that I think it will splinter what's left of the Oslo framework on the ground. And I'm not talking about negotiations. I'm talking about the Palestinian Authority, which is a creature of the Oslo Agreement, which has authorities delegated to it by Israel, and will not be able to sustain that function in the face of Israeli annexation. It's certainly not the kind of annexation that is envisioned by the Trump plan. So to me, Trump's reelection would send this conflict into a dangerous, violent trajectory, not because of the passions of those on the ground, but because the structures that have helped to tamp down this conflict over the last quarter century, they haven't solved it, but they have contained it. And we don't know what the world looks like when those structures are no longer containing this conflict, but it's not a world I want to live in.
Telling points, Tamara. Nabil, does it make a difference who is elected? Uh-oh.
Oh dear.
There goes Nabil. Well, let's move to Shlomo. What kind of
it makes
it makes a difference. What kind of difference would it make?
Well, the Democratic Party today is different than the Democratic Party in the times of Clinton. It has moved quite to the left, and therefore I think that it would be very much more combative with regard to Israeli annexationist policies. I think it would be very bad news for Netanyahu, for the settlers, and for the Israeli right and far right. I guess that they will try to reactivate in some way the peace process, not along the lines of the deal of the century, a disaster of Japan. I think no sensible person can concur with the idea that you will have a Palestinian state surrounded totally by Israeli sovereign territory, in full control of the exits. I think that is a plan that needs to be sent to the dustbin of history. And I hope this is what the Democratic Party would do in case of a Biden election. Whether they will be able to reach a final settlement along the lines of 67, I am still skeptical. But at least they might civilize the dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians.
It's a trend.
I think, if I may, Aaron, there's one more thing that Biden presidency would do immediately that's absolutely essential, which is rebuild the American relationship with the Palestinians. The Trump administration cut essentially all aid to the Palestinian Authority. It shut down our consulate in Jerusalem. It made clear that it wanted to take basic Palestinian demands off the table in the negotiations. And so we cannot mediate right now because we have no relationship with one of the parties.
No, that
absolutely
would clearly be an imperative should Vice President Biden become president. I think there's no question about that. Well, Nabil is gone, but I'm glad we had him for most of the panel. I want to thank Tamara and Shlomo. I leave actually buoyed to some degree by the thoughtfulness and even to some degree hopefulness of your presentations. I'd only close with a quote from Jack Kennedy, who described himself as an idealist without illusion. And as far as I'm concerned, that's where I am. And I think that's where we are all going to need to be, basically to never give up on the prospects, in this case, that something can be achieved that would end the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. But as we do so, particularly on the American side, Nabil, you're back. I was just saying that I'm looking for a measure of hope. So idealism without illusion. Never give up on the prospects that the conflict can be resolved. We don't have the right to do that. Certainly, Americans don't have the right to do it. But as we go through the process, let's go through it with our eyes wide open. So Nabil, thank you so much. Tamara, thank you. And Shlomo, haven't seen you for quite a while, and Nabil as well. Thank you. Thanks for joining. It was a rich conversation. And until the next session of Carnegie Connects, over and out.